Okay, welcome to my final PowerPoint in AC 4.1, and this time I'm going to look at how sociological theories have informed policy development, so how they've changed laws in society, the way we relate to crime and criminals, how that has been influenced by sociological theories. So let's make a start, and we'll just have a very broad policy to start with, and that's to say that in general sociological theories will say that any policies that tackle inequality, so welfare, fair wages, job security, education, etc., are all going to be influenced by sociological theory, and in particular Merton's strain theory, because Merton's strain theory provides a basis for crime control and reduction policies, because if society's structure is more equal, then there's less likely to be crime, so Merton would argue. So policies to tackle poverty, so better welfare benefits, wages and job security, they will reduce crime by giving everyone a more equal chance of achieving success by legal means. So the fact that we have the minimum wage rising would be seen as a positive policy that's been influenced by sociological theory. Having equal opportunities in school, treating working class pupils equally, reducing their failure rate, making them less likely to suffer status frustration and join delinquent subcultures, again will be a policy that will be influenced by sociological theories. And of course we know that education in prison is also really important, and again is influenced by sociological theory. When you consider that half of UK prisoners have a reading age of 11, any policy that looks at better education in prisons helps inmates to gain skills, helps them to get a job, helps them to go straight. So sociological theory influencing there. Now, Marxism would also go along with these policies to tackle inequality. So, to some extent, any policy that addresses the divide between rich and poor is going to be supported by Marxism. Also, any structural changes within society that tackle things like discrimination, inequality of opportunity, unfairness of rewards, they would be welcomed by Marxists, along with the provision of good jobs and housing for all. That would be a Marxist policy. And also, Marxists would support any policy that places the ownership of business with the state and not private companies. So for instance, if we're looking at criminology, Marxism would not support private prisons or probation companies, CRCs. And of course we know that CRCs have been a failure, and the government has moved those back into government control, and Marxists would applaud that and would support that. And evidence clearly shows that anti-poverty policies have a positive effect. Societies that spend more on welfare jail fewer people. If you have a society where there's a greater inequality, a bigger divide between rich and poor, like the USA, in general, they have higher crime rates. Where there's a huge gap between rich and poor, higher crime rates persist. So let's move on and look at how labelling theory might influence policy. Now, one policy that will be influenced by labelling theory is decriminalisation, because if you decriminalise minor offences such as, say, possession of cannabis, that means fewer people will be arrested for possession of cannabis, and therefore they won't be labelled as criminals. And of course, if you have a criminal record, that prevents you getting a job, and that leads to fewer opportunities and therefore secondary deviance and ultimately criminality. And you can start to see how in this map cannabis is gradually being decriminalised around the world. So big differences there, and maybe that's influenced by labelling theory to some extent. Also, diversion policies will be influenced by labelling theory. Now, diversion policy is anything that aims to keep an offender out of the justice system. So you're diverting them away from being charged with a criminal offence. So you're not labelling them as criminals. So you have informal diversion policies, like the police using their discretion not to charge someone, and others are more formal, such as where magistrates might require an offender to attend an anger management course as a punishment for doing something. So they're not labelled as a criminal, but you rectify the problem of anger by sending them on a course, not locking them up and labelling them. And the police have done a lot of this, and you can go onto this link, and that's what the College of Policing are talking about, diversion policies here. So mediation, diversion models, restorative justice, outdoor challenges, etc., etc. And you can have a look at the documentation by clicking on that link, or copy that link if you're watching on YouTube. Reintegrative shaming is an interesting policy that's been linked to labelling theory, and this is where the act is labelled but not the actor. So as if to say, she has done a bad thing, rather than he or she is a bad person. So it's avoiding that label, it's avoiding that stigma that in some way the offender is evil, but it's still encouraging them to repent and encouraging others to admit them back into society. So where you have evidence of that, there's lots to show that crime control policies that are based on labelling theory can deal successfully with minor offences and young offenders. So if you avoid labelling people as criminals and keeping them out of the justice system, then you avoid pushing them into a deviant career. So this is the sort of thing they do in America, where you have someone labelled as a thief and they have to stand outside the place where they stole. So I'm a thief, I stole from Walmart. Labelling theory would not like this. So reintegrative shaming would not go with this sort of thing, because what you're doing is you're labelling the person here. They would prefer something like this. I am a person who stole from Walmart. So you're not labelling that person as a thief, you're just labelling the action. So that's what we mean by reintegrative shaming. Hopefully that makes sense. Moving on to right realism, where we're getting a bit more right wing here. A policy that's been influenced by right realism is situational crime prevention. Now, situational crime prevention policies, what they're trying to do is reduce the opportunities for crime by increasing the risks or the difficulties of committing the crime, and also reducing the rewards. So if you remember, right realism is based on rational choice theory. This is the idea that the offenders act rationally. They weigh up the risks and the rewards of a crime opportunity. So what you do is you make it, as they're weighing it up, it harder for them to get a reward and greater risks. So therefore they choose, using rational choice, not to commit the crime. So situational crime prevention is stuff like target hardening measures, locking cars, employing security guards, reshaping the crime, the environment to design crime out of the area. So here you can see these bollards that go up in the middle of the street to stop ram raiding and that sort of stuff. That is an example of situational crime prevention. And it's true to say that target hardening definitely makes it harder for criminals to commit crime in an area where targets have been hardened. But there is a criticism, there's a flip side to this, because a problem with situational crime prevention is if as right realists say, criminals are acting rationally, well, all they'll do is if they find a target too hard to crack, they'll simply look for a softer one. So, for example, they may commit crime at a different time or place, or use a different method, or indeed choose a different target. So that might result in a more vulnerable targets, such as the old, the poor, the disabled, being victimised more because other targets have been hardened. And that is a potential issue with situational crime prevention. Excuse me. Environmental crime prevention is also linked to right realism. We have broken windows theory that says if you have a disorganized neighborhood, a disorderly neighborhood, it sends out the message that nobody cares. That then attracts offenders who then calculate that their activities won't be investigated. That means that serious crime increases and law-abiding citizens move out, and so it all goes to hell. Broken windows theory says what you've got to do is mend stuff as soon as it gets broken so that this doesn't happen. So you have an environmental improvement strategy so that all signs of disorder have to be tackled promptly. You remove graffiti, you repair broken windows, etc., etc. But at the same time, you have a zero tolerance strategy, a zero tolerance policing strategy. You take a tough zero tolerance stance towards all crime, even the most trivial. And they would argue that police should concentrate on tackling quality of life offences such as aggressive begging, prostitution, vandalism, etc. And that makes the place nicer to live in if you haven't got that hanging around. And let's follow on now a bit with zero tolerance policing. So it was introduced in New York by Rudy Giuliani, and crime fell when it was introduced. But at the same time, it could be argued that may not have been due to zero tolerance policing. In fact, many US cities also reported that crime fell and they weren't using zero tolerance policing. Some studies have found that zero tolerance policing curfews actually increase juvenile crime because it removes the law-abiding youths from the streets, which leaves them emptier and more favourable to crime for the non-law-abiding youths. And also there's a definite link with ZTP and the targeting of ethnic minorities due to institutional racism within the police and confrontations due to heavy-handed military policing. So zero tolerance policing leads to more stop and searches, and that tends to be on black and ethnic minorities. And also it would be true to say that situational crime protection and zero tolerance policing don't tackle the structural causes of crime. They're not dealing with inequality, etc. And of course they're ignoring the crimes of the powerful, such as white collar and state crime. So that is another issue with those two. Another policy that's linked to right realism is penal populism, and particularly rising prison numbers. Right realists argue that because criminals make a rational choice to offend by weighing up the costs and benefits of offending, what you've got to do is make the costs higher. So therefore you introduce tougher penalties to deter criminals from committing crimes. So in the 1990s, we had in the UK the Prisons Works policy. For the 1990s, all our governments started to take the view that tougher penalties were needed, and they argued that prison works. So in the right realist view, prison works because it has two functions. It incapacitates the criminals, makes them incapable of harming the public because they're locked up. Jail takes them out of circulation. At the same time, it acts as a deterrence because criminals think twice before offending when they see the tough punishments that have been handed out. Now that is the thinking behind it with right realism. And of course politicians believed that these tough penalties were popular with the public, and so the policy became known as penal populism. Penal as in penitentiary, locking people up. It's popular to lock people up for long times. So for example, in 1997 the Conservatives brought in the Crime Sentences Act, which introduced mandatory minimum sentences for repeat offenders. So they had to be given these at the least. So you had an automatic life sentence for a second serious sexual violent offence. You had a minimum of 7 years for a third Class A trafficking conviction. Notice it's tackling recidivism here. And a minimum of 3 years for a third domestic burglary conviction. Now, did it work? Well, Conservatives brought it in, a right-wing government, and actually when a left-wing government came in, they carried that on as well. So when Tony Blair's new Labour government came to power in 1997, promising to be tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, they actually introduced even more stringent measures such as ASBOs and curfews, etc. And what did this result in? Well, this resulted in numbers in jail rising drastically. So 45,000 people were in jail in 1993, 80,000 in 2021. So our prison population, as a result of penal populism, nearly doubled. And so England and Wales actually imprison a bigger proportion of their population than any other Western European country. So is that solving crime? Is it working? Well, you can judge yourselves, but in 2020, 76 suicides in prison, 5 homicides, 65,000 incidents of self-harm, 9,800 assaults on staff within the prison system. Is doubling that prison system working? Is doubling the prison system and cutting the number of prison officers working? Have you got enough capacity there to educate prisoners, etc.? Well, the right realist approach, and as you can see, I'm not a fan of it, I would question its effectiveness. Yes, you're banging them up, but are you really solving the problem or creating an even bigger problem by doing so? You form your own opinion on that. So, you could argue with penal populism that prison might be said to work temporarily, because offenders obviously can't commit crimes against the public while they're in jail, but they often offend against fellow inmates and staff. And of course, overcrowding, budget cuts mean many prisoners don't get access to the education, the skills training, the treatment programs that would rehabilitate them and help them become law-abiding citizens. Really, right realism is not interested in rehabilitation, I would argue. And obviously, imprisonment is clearly ineffective in preventing recidivism, repeat offending. 48% of adults in this country are reconvicted within a year of release. If tougher prison sentences deterred people, rational choice, etc., that really worked, you'd expect that recidivism rate to be going down. It hasn't been going down. Since we've brought in penal populism, actually it's been going up. So right realists also argue the risk of jail deters would-be criminals who make that rational choice before offending. However, as I said, just a moment ago, studies show that risk of imprisonment doesn't deter people at all, and in fact doesn't affect overall crime rates in the least. So it's a false theory. So that finally leaves us for a couple of slides on left realism, a little more woolly and liberal. So left realists are obviously seeing the root cause of crime as an unequal and unfair social structure. So very similar to Marxism here. Their theory has been applied via 3 policies to reduce crime, I would argue. So any policy, once again, that reduces inequality. So left realists would call for major structural changes to tackle discrimination, inequality of opportunity, unfairness rewards, good jobs, housing, etc. So it's no different from functionalists, Merton and Marxism here. So they would argue you should reduce relative deprivation, which is the main cause of crime. They would also argue for democratic policing. Now, left realists argue that the police are losing public support, especially in poorer areas, because they're widely distrusted. And if the police are distrusted, what actually happens is their flow of information dries up, and therefore they can't solve crimes. They have to rely on military policing, such as stop and searches. And that then creates further loss of cooperation, meaning they even more can't tackle crime effectively. It's a spiralling circle of not working. So left realists would argue that to win back public support, the police have got to be more involved in local communities. They've got to decide their priorities with the local communities helping them to do that. They've got to focus on crimes that victimise the disadvantaged in society, such as domestic violence, hate crimes, rather than offences such as the possession of soft drugs, etc. So they would argue for things like neighbourhood policing and police community support officers, PCSOs, should be introduced to build better relationships with the communities. Many forces now are making cannabis possession a low priority crime, and of course domestic violence and hate crime are now a much higher priority. So they're a policy that has been influenced by left realism. And finally, left realists would argue for a multi-agency approach. So left realists would say that crime control's got to involve not just the police but other agencies, schools, youth service, housing departments, social service, the probation service, the NHS, and local councils need to improve facilities for young people to provide them with alternatives to crime. So an example you could use of a left realist policy, the No Knives Better Lives multi-agency approach to reducing knife crime, where a wide range of agencies, including schools, local councils, leisure and youth services and voluntary organisations, all get together to try and find ways of engaging with youth and getting rid of knife crime. So lots of policies there influenced by sociological theories. You can choose which ones you want to use, but you should have more than enough for the exam. I hope you found this section useful, and I shall see you soon for another PowerPoint. Goodbye.